welcome everyone to our March botany night. I will start with a land acknowledgement. Want to start off by stating that we're grateful and honored to be living on and sharing the natural beauty of the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. We appreciate that their past centuries of stewardship have preserved these beautiful areas for our enjoyment today and acknowledge the need to work with them to safeguard these lands and all their inhabitants for future generations to appreciate. Whether you're here in Vancouver or joining us from the territories of another First Nations, as indeed our presenter tonight is, we urge you to join us in a moment of reflection and commitment. So now to tonight's talk, which is especially a long-awaited one. It was originally scheduled for last April, but unfortunately, Sasha had to cancel. We were really delighted to finally have him back with us and doing this, I'm sure, very interesting presentation on native orchids of Vancouver Island through the season. So Sasha Kubicek is an orchid enthusiast, a photographer, and a wilderness explorer. As an avid orchid grower of over 30 years, Sasha has been exploring the wilds of Vancouver Island, documenting and photographing the island's native species for over 2 decades. Sasha has also traveled to many parts of the world documenting native species in the wild. This particular presentation tonight will showcase the island's native species, when to see them in bloom, their habitat, and variations in color and form. So this is a very great thing to be brushing up on just as spring's getting underway, so you can plan some exciting field trips to see the orchids and other spring flowers on Vancouver Island. So please join me tonight in welcoming Sasha Kubicek.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking time out of your evening. And yeah, this has been a couple years in the making. So I'm really happy to finally be able to share some great photos and information to adventure out into what's hoping to be a great wildflower season. So there we go. All right. So I've been bitten by the orchid bug since a young age, and it's just a really fascinating plant family, a very old plant family, all the way to 80 million years ago. And there's almost 30,000 different species, and orchids are just unique because they're just so diverse in colors and sizes. So here's a great example of the world's biggest orchid on the left by that gentleman. And then one of the small little guys, almost the size of a thumbnail. So it's a very diverse plant family. They're found on all 5 continents, which is just amazing. Their color and shapes and pollinating and just survival tactics are just phenomenal. So you can just see here, these are some tropical orchids, the shapes and colors. It's just an incredible plant family. Orchids are very unique as they've got the smallest seeds in the plant world, and they don't give them any energy stores. And orchids have to rely on special mycorrhizal fungus relationships where the fungus actually taps into the plant, and then the seed steals energy, and that's how it gets its first legs into life, is connecting with these funguses. Now, everyone thinks that orchids are very rare, but it's actually the funguses that the orchids need to germinate that are rare. And the reason is all orchids, these special funguses, they live in primary old growth, untouched ecosystems. And that's what's getting rarer and rarer in the world, especially right now. But there's these very unique funguses that may grow only under a certain tree, in a certain ravine, under a certain or a special rock. And that's where the orchid seed has to fall and then connect with the fungus and then grow. So it's a very unique relationship, and something that just doesn't happen all over the place. So when we say orchids are rare, it's actually the funguses that are rare. And here's a great example of primary orchid habitat. This is up on a subalpine ridge on Vancouver Island. There's about 4 different species right off the trail, and just pristine, primary, untouched ecosystems is where you can find orchids. So that's kind of one of our first things getting into the wildflower season, is trying to find, parks that have not had any logging or impacts from man, or special little nooks and crannies around our few wild places that we have, to find areas that still have intact grounds where all of the funguses are living underneath, and there's a good chance that orchids are in these environments. My presentation is about the orchids on Vancouver Island. Many of these species that I'm going to be sharing with you guys today are also found on the mainland. So there'll be some of these that you may have encountered on many of your hiking trips or adventures. So there's definitely a cross of populations. Some are very unique to Vancouver Island, and I am jealous you guys do have some really great ones on the mainland that we don't have on the island. So because orchids are such a global plant family, it's almost like a common language. You get to talk orchids kind of anywhere in the world. Vancouver Island is unique. We've got lots of coastline, and then very quickly we can get up to very alpine glacier type mountains. So we've got a wide range of ecosystems in a island setting. So we've got a really diverse amount of habitat for orchids. I've arranged this presentation through the seasons, which kind of can give you some ideas on when to look for these in bloom. This year is a bit late. I was out a couple days ago, and the first 2, usually the first plants in bloom, they're probably 2-3 weeks away. And I know some years, kind of middle of March, I've been able to find the first pink lady slipper or the little tway blade. So it's a little bit of a later year, I'm finding, but I'll kind of take you through the months and through the seasons, and you can kind of learn about some plants, and maybe plan some adventures to see some. So the first kind of flush of orchids happen in April and May, and a little bit into March on certain years. And it's a bit of a toss-up. The pink lady slipper or the little toy blade usually is the first one to bloom. Some years this little guy is first, some years the pink lady slipper is first. So it's kind of fun trying to find which one's blooming first. So and just a quick note, I'm not a taxonomist, so if I mispronounce or have an older version of a name, I'm more an orchid enthusiast. So I know there's the taxonomists in the crowd, so if you can just bear with me, we all just love orchids for what they are. So the little tway blade is very small. It's tiny. Here are some arbutus leaves. So you got to be really and there's little twigs and moss. So I think this is a great picture for scale. You got to be really on it to find this little guy. So this is a green form. It comes in several color forms. That first picture was a red one, but I think this is a great picture of how you can see this scale for this little one. Then they've also got sort of a bicolor, and in between, this is a kind of a mix between red and green. And I'll just quickly go back on the left there. I'm not sure if you can see my mouse. There's a mosquito up here. I've really noticed mosquitoes love the tway blades. And I have some other pictures. I didn't dig them up, but I've got like 30 mosquitoes all on the flowers there. Whether they actually pollinate and all that, I just haven't had time enough to sit and watch. But they're definitely associated with these little guys. And then, yeah, here's another close-up of the pure kind of a green form. And it's a lot of fun. You can have multiple colors in a same patch, so it's neat to kind of just keep your once your eye trains on finding them, you can then start having another game of trying to find different color forms. And I find these really like kind of Douglas fir, kind of bluffy environments. So that's kind of one of our first orchids to be looking for. The other one is one of my favorites. It's just spectacular. And it's our pink lady slipper, the Calypso. It's just such a treat to see this little one. They can come in some great clumps. I've been watching some that get to sort of 20 to 30 years old, and then it kind of crashes, and then it doesn't really get as big as more. So you can have single flowers or multiple ones, and it's just a delight. On Vancouver Island, we kind of have two main color forms. On the left, the lip is almost all sort of red. You can see the spots almost merge in together to be almost a solid color. And then on the right, there's just more of the speckles on there. So I find those are the two main colors that you can find. Here's another great picture of a big mature plant with many spikes, and they've got very distinct leaves, these beautiful sort of diamondy heart-shaped leaves. And most of the growing happens actually in November, December, January. So all of the vegetative growth happens in the winter. And then right around now, these little spikes are coming up, and in a couple weeks, we're going to have our first ones in bloom. So when you're out in the forest, keep an eye out for these. When they're early on, they're solitary, and then they can form these great clumps. And again, this one really enjoys Douglas fir and mossy habitats. When you're exploring enough, you can sometimes chance upon some unique color forms. You can see this one on the left, there's no pigment in the stem, in the flower stem. Here's a regular one, and you can see how purple the stem is, but this one is lacking the flower pigments, and sure enough, what a beautiful, almost albicans type light coloring in this one. So this was a really incredible find when I found this one. And then the holy grail of the Calypso is finding the absolute pure white. So you can see there's absolutely no color in the stem and absolutely no color in the flower. This is just absolute magic. I can't tell you how that was about 27 years till I found this one. So it's quite rare to find. So this is just a beautiful beautiful species. After the Twayblade and Calypso, the striped coral root is sort of next on the roster. That's sort of late April into May. They pop out. This is an orchid that doesn't have leaves. It's just one that lives just in the ground, tapping into the mycorrhizal networks. And it's actually quite because of that, it can live in quite shady environments. I find them really associated with red cedars, where there's nothing really else growing in the ground, and then you have these kind of haunting striped orchids popping up there. This is a great picture. You can kind of just see the orchids popped up in quite deep shade there. And they're quite big. The flower is almost the size of a quarter. So when you have a large display like this, it's a really spectacular coral root orchid. So I really enjoy this one. They're not as common as the regular coral root. So I've only got a few areas where we found these, and they're quite neat. And right behind the striped coral root is just our regular coral root orchid. And it's on the left here, you can see the dried up seed pods from the prior year. So this is actually a great way in the winter or summer when these have long finished flowering, you can look for their seed pods. And then if you make a mental note of where you see seed pods, and if you come in the spring, that's where you can hopefully find some flowers the next year. So it's a great little orchid, lots of color. I find this one grows much more habitats than the striped coral root. This one's the fungus it must be associated with is much more diverse. So you can find this one in a lot more areas. Again, I find it a lot more with Douglas fir, and they can have some great displays. Just some really big clumps can form, and it's just a really really nice coral root. And if you're lucky, there's almost this is sort of the albino one without pigment, and it's almost like a yellow, an aurea form. So this I've only found this a couple times, and it's like a pure yellow version. There's no spotting. You can see the pigment is just the yellow one in there, and yeah, it's a really neat one. So when the regular one is blooming, keep your eye out to find that needle in the haystack of a pure yellow one. So that's kind of April and May. Moving into June, it's still kind of coral root season. So some of the later flowering kinds happen. Mertensiana, this one, it's pretty neat because it can be kind of lower down and it goes way up into the mountains. So into the subalpine, you can find some great patches of these, especially on like ski hills like Cypress and Seymour. I'm not sure how it is on the mainland, but in a lot of ski areas here where there's still old growth trees in the ski runs, you can find some good patches of these. And they come in all kind of colors, so it's a lot of fun. You've got almost a pure white one on the right, kind of in between, a colorful one. They can be quite vibrant. Look at this, almost like a vinicolor. Then the other one a little more yellow. So it's a really neat, coral root with a lot of color variation. So it's a lot of fun. Just trying to keep your eyes out for some color that looks a little unique and try to find something different. And sort of the latest of the coral roots is the variety ozatensis. This is also found in Washington State and on Vancouver Island. I'm not sure if it's found on the mainland. It's found on a lot of the Gulf Islands as well. And it's sort of the last coral root to bloom. And it's similar to the spotted one, but just without the spots. So that's sort of a way to look for it, is one that isn't the kind of pure yellow, but it's one with pigment, but just no spots. So, and I just find this one's not as vigorous as the regular coral root, but a nice addition into the family. And then the very rare sort of, as the name says, phantom orchid. These are super rare on Vancouver Island. There's, I think, 3 or 4 locations that are known. And then the plant, it takes, 7 to 9 years for it to get to blooming size from seed. And then even once it's blooming size, it only will bloom on certain years. So it's a very rare, the conditions have to be just right for it to actually produce a bloom. Some areas just lay dormant for years, and then when things are right, it pops up. But it's a very beautiful orchid with a beautiful deep egg yolk yellow lip there. So yeah, this is a very, very special plant. And yeah, in July, all of a sudden, things kind of get white and green. So all of the sort of colorful orchids are finished, and now the summer is to these white and green orchids. And a big group of them are called piperias. And right now, and especially through the last couple months, these big luscious leaves are growing, and the bulb down in the ground is getting all this energy to produce these tall flower spikes with lots of blooms. So this is a great way to earmark where these plants are going to be blooming in July by looking for these big luscious leaves right now, because come July, the leaf is absolutely gone, and you just get this you just get the flower stem. So it's hard to know where they are if you don't have the leaf there. So the first piperia is transversa, and a lot of these look the same, but their nectar spur is a way to identify them. So you can see on the right here, the nectar spur is totally horizontal, and that's a great way. In the Latin name transverse, it's a very horizontal nectar spur. So that's a very easy way to identify this one. And it likes, again, Douglas fir, lots of rocky, bluffy areas. I know it's very common on the Gulf Islands and along a lot of our bluffy areas on the island. It can come in some great patches. You can again see the very distinct horizontal nectar spur, and it's a great way to identify this piperia. The next one, it's a little bit bigger plant, a much larger flower spike, and almost impossible to identify them just by the leaves in the spring. But this one, elongata, has a straight down nectar spur. So where transversa is straight across, elongata has a nectar spur going straight down, and they can be quite big. I've had these almost 2 meters tall spikes on some of these when they're super mature. So this one can get quite big. Here's an amazing big patch. I think it was 2 years ago. We had the wettest spring that I can remember. It was just absolute bonkers for these piperias. They must have just gotten so much moisture, and it was the biggest bloom of these I've ever seen in my life. So this was just a mega patch of elongata the 2 years ago. One of the later ones, and one of my favorites, this one I find grows very close, sometimes even into Salt Spray area on the coast. It's very close to the ocean, is elegans, and it's a very beautiful white piperia. It's got a very kind of more orchid-like flower, and they've got these big kind of bottle brush spikes. Believe it or not, this little patch here is right beside the Bay Street Bridge in downtown Victoria. There's a little patch of native primary little forest on a bluff, and I found this incredible patch. So you just never know, even in an urban setting, if there's a little bit of old trees or an old area that fungus is still living there, there's a chance an orchid could be there. And again, you can kind of see here, you can see the withered leaves. Those were those luscious green leaves that we saw in the spring, and these are all dried up, and then all that's left are the spikes. And here's a great picture of a seed pod beside one of these. So these are things you can be looking for in the winter or in the fall when things are out of bloom, just to be ready for the spring. And this is a very unique one I found. It just had such round petals. It was just one in a sort of a million plant. I've never seen one with such round petals. So that was a very special a round form. A more kind of green goblin-y little guy is Unulacensis. They've got much narrower leaves. You can kind of see these, and they grow in very shady areas, and they don't actually, depending on the year, they may hold on to their green leaves. So that's a great way to identify this one, and just these tiny little green flowers. So this is a very shadier growing one, but again, a similar theme. A very rare one is Candida. This one, I found a very southern population in Souk on Vancouver Island, and it's got this beautiful sort of white with a little bit of green. And here's a plant of it, again, a very classic, the green leaves. It doesn't lose in the very shady environment, it keeps its leaves. And the same species, but this was maybe 200 feet away, was growing super dry on this bluff above the river, and its leaves were almost dry. So just a very unique, two totally different habitats, total shade to full sun and very dry. So this is a very sort of tough plant that it can handle such extremes, but very, very rare on Vancouver Island. You don't find these that much. So, um, and then the tway blade reappears in July with another species. So this one is more in sort of the subalpine forests. You can find this in a lot of the mountain hikes in the old growth up there. They have these big, luscious leaves. There's my hand for scale. Some of these can get really big. And then they have these unique green flowers. Yeah, just kind of a very leprechaun kind of green, just a very, very pretty tway blade. And on the right ear, you can sometimes in the subalpine have the the cordata tway blade blooming with this one at the same time. It's a very unique thing. I've never found a natural hybrid between the two. They may share different pollinators, but they do. I have found them blooming at the same time beside each other. So I'm always on the lookout if they may not naturally cross. Then there's another, while we're up in the Alpine, there's a whole sort of suite of bog orchids that are called Plantantheras. And the classic green bog orchid, this is a very widespread orchid all over BC in all kind of sphagnum-y, wet seepages, very, very popular while you're hiking and you cross a little bridge. If you just look up into the little ravine there, if it's an old growth area, you'll most likely find a green bog orchid. So a very, very, this is our most common green bog orchid. Here's a great example. This is up in Strathcona Park on Vancouver Island. It's a very moist area. There's a bit of heather, some valerian, and then the green bog orchid peppered all in there. So just a very classic scene of where you could find this guy. One of the smallest Plantantheras is Corisiana, and this one took a long time for me to figure out how it's growing and where it's growing. It likes to grow underneath these leaves of this other plant, and it's a very tiny little green orchid. It barely opens up. It kind of looks like a little devil horn. Yeah, it's not much bigger than your little finger, so it's a very, very unique little orchid. So that's grows only I find up in our subalpine sphagnum bogs on Vancouver Island. So a very unique little orchid. A much bigger, more robust one is Huronensis. It's kind of hard to differentiate between stricta, the regular bog orchid, but I've got a good friend, Hans Romer, is a very famous botanist who lives on Vancouver Island. He had a great little cheat sheet, and it's all depends on the nectar spur on how it's arranged. So I wish I had that to share with you guys, the little diagram he drew, but this is a big green bog orchid here, the Huronensis, not as common. And then one that I think most of us have maybe seen if we're hiking up in the alpine meadows is dilatata. And this orchid just smells so beautifully, and it's such a big, beautiful white flower. Yeah, there's just it's just such a spectacular orchid up in the alpine, subalpine areas. Yeah, just beautiful. Here's a classic. There's a gentian in a sphagnum bog with a little tarn there. Yeah, just a beautiful. Yeah, those are great summer days looking for orchids in the bogs. And yeah, they can be quite profuse and lots of neat native pollinators attracted to them, butterflies. And like I said, they have a beautiful fragrance. So if you haven't bent down and tried to smell them, give that a try. It's just a lovely smell. And then moving higher than the subalpine. This is a great picture of the alpine on Vancouver Island. This is actually a picture from my friend Shane Johnson. He's a I consider myself an orchid nerd. Shane is a mega flower nerd. He is just so enthusiastic about every kind of flower, and he does a lot of exploring on Vancouver Island. And he and I were talking many years ago about this Cypripedium montanum that was recorded to have been found on Vancouver Island in this remote park in the middle of the island. And it was just such an exotic idea that this incredible Cypripedium is actually on Vancouver Island. There was this old PDF online, and a couple of years ago, Shane organized an expedition. I wasn't on it, and he went up into the alpine of Vancouver Island, and he actually went to the area and found the Cypripedium. So this was just monumental. I think it was like 40 years later that the orchid was refound by Shane and his friends up in that park. So it's just so unique to have Cypripediums on Vancouver Island, and it was a very unique limestone alpine environment. And yeah, this was just a major find for Vancouver Island, and I really thank Shane for letting me use his pictures in the slideshow here. So if there's someone really adventurous, there's some, and I think there's more of this orchid on Vancouver Island. There's very similar limestone alpine habitats, just no one's been exploring those at the right time of year. So I wish I had won $1 million and was able to go around in the summer searching for more of these. But yeah, definitely this is, I think, the most colorful exotic orchid we've got on the island. Kind of winding down in the season, we're into August and September, and things don't get as bright and as colorful. We're into the late summer, very dry periods in time. This is actually a invasive species, Epipactis. It comes from out east of North America, and it's the most resilient orchid. I've seen this in a little wood chip median in Canadian Tire in the middle of the parking lot. It found some kind of fungus in that wood chips and was growing. It can pretty much grow everywhere. It can actually become a weed in people's gardens. Yeah, so it's very orchid-like, but it's not native to our coast. So one of the latest flowering plants is the beautiful Spiranthes, and it's just a very unique. You can see that lady tress, that tresses kind of spiral with the flowers, how they spiral themselves up in perfect lines. And this orchid actually smells beautifully of vanilla. It's a very nice smell as well. But it's a very diverse orchid. You can see here, look how crisp and dry that environment is where it's blooming. And then here are two totally opposite environments. The one on the left is on limestone, right on a lake shore. It was in seepages. And then on the right here, this is again back up in those subalpine bogs in a sphagnum bog. So it's just pretty crazy that the same species can be crisp dry to absolutely wet in sphagnum, or in this unique kind of lakeshore habitat. So a very nice late season, kind of mid-August to even early September. I've got them blooming. I've found them blooming. So that's one of our latest orchids to bloom. And then our rattlesnake plantain. I'm sure everyone's seen this somewhere in a park or in a hike. It's actually quite an adaptable species and can repopulate second growth forests. And it has these beautiful mottled leaves. And they get these, depending how dry the year is, their flowers can actually fully open, and you've got a very intricate sort of lip and some colors there. So yeah, it's a neat little orchid, but on dry years, they just don't open that much, and you don't get to enjoy their flower that much. And same thing, these are definitely in August. So one of our latest flowering plants. And then if the flower isn't too flashy, you can kind of hunt for different leaf color forms. So you can see on the left, it's almost fully green, and it's getting more and more patterns to absolutely some spectacular patterns. So it's a lot of fun just trying to see what kind of a unique pattern you can find on these. They're quite beautiful out of bloom. And about 5 years ago, I made a big discovery, and I found the rattlesnake plantain growing totally epiphytic on trees on Vancouver Island. You can see here in the moss on these trees. This is about 30 feet high up on the tree. They've been establishing themselves totally epiphytically on these trees. Here's another, this is a total branch about 20 feet off the ground, and they're just growing totally epiphytically like that on the branches. So where fogs come in the summer from the ocean, there must be enough humidity that they can survive like this. So that was a very unique find. I wrote a little article in the American Orchid Society Bulletin, and yeah, I just really blown away how versatile this orchid is. And that's coming to the end of our seasons of the orchids there. So I hope that gave you a good glimpse into what to look forward to in the year, and I'll open it up to questions.
Okay, so you're now free to unmute yourself if you have a question, or you can type your questions into the chat. There's a question here. I don't know whether it applied to a particular orchid or in general, as to how long do they flower for. So for each kind of particular species, would it be like a couple of weeks, or would there be like a month, or depending on elevation? I guess some of them would go, but on, say, in a given location, how long would they flower?
It's dependent on the species. So some don't last long, and some can be open for many weeks. So it's more specific to the species, as well as to the type of year we're having. When it's like I mentioned, that very wet spring we had a couple years ago, calypsos were in bloom for over a month, which was just crazy. Yet on very dry years, they may not even last a week. So it's very dependent on the type of year we're having. So yeah.
Okay. Can you see?
Thank you, Sasha. This is Adele. I have a question. I have two questions. No, question one is, how do you know it's a non-orchid flower? How do you distinguish? How do you know? Because there are so many different species. How do you know a particular flower is orchid and not other flowers? This might sound really silly. Second question is, where do you go on Vancouver Island to find those orchids?
So your first question, yeah, usually orchids have a sort of five kind of petal type things, and a lip and a pollen thing. So usually orchids have a dorsal sepal, two petals, and two other petals there. So kind of these five petals, and then a lip with a pollen thing. It's very hard to they're just so diverse, but I think the main thing is looking for the type of pollen and anther cap that they've got. There's a lot of things online that can kind of give you a good idea there. And there's so much with iNaturalist and all these forums, and that if you just throw that up there, there's a lot of quite talented people that can confirm if it's an orchid or not. And
Right.
then where on Vancouver Island, there's, you know, out my way, I live out just outside of Victoria. There's any of the parks like Mount Work Park, John Dean Park, Gowland Todd Park, Goldstream Park, Eastwood Park, all of those parks. The key is trying to find areas that haven't been logged, that haven't been disturbed
Ah,
by people, and then look for orchids that way. In a lot of places, they grow right on the sides of the trails. So yeah, look for
okay.
undisturbed wild areas.
Right. Thank you so much. This is fantastic. Thank you very much.
Cool.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Ray Paul is asking, what was the name of the introduced helleborine? Pretty sure that is what popped up unexpectedly in our front garden.
Yeah, that's the one. Epipactis helleborine. So it's an Epipactis is the genus, and yeah, they pop up in gardens. They can actually overwhelm gardens. Yeah, they're pretty. It's a pretty resilient orchid. So that's the one. Epipactis.
Okay, is there anybody else from the audience? I have a few that that came up with. One question was the cephalanthera, the phantom orchid that you showed at the beginning with the yellow lip. When I was doing my research on a presentation I did on European orchids, it mentioned that the cephalantheras used that kind of yellow patterning on the lip was thought to be kind of a false pollen that lured insects in to pollinate the orchid, thinking that they were getting a food supply, but in fact it was just kind of yellow pigment. So I was curious about whether that was also true of the phantom orchid, whether it actually had nectar or whether it didn't have nectar. And also I was curious because so many of the European orchids seem to have all these different techniques for kind of tricking insects into pollinating them, very often without actually giving them any nectar as a reward, whether most of our BC orchids did that, or were they what I call honest orchids that kind of actually provided the insect with something?
Great questions. And I think a lot of there's just not enough studies that have had on the actual who's pollinating our native orchids, and the relationships of those pollinators, whether they're getting any nectar or if they're being deceived. So there's a lot of research on more tropical orchids and more Mediterranean and other orchids on the actual answers to those kind of questions. We just need more research and more enthusiasts out there. So it's kind of not that well documented.
Okay, we have another question in the chat. Zhang asks, is the white calypso, I guess both the pure white one and the pale one, are they flowering at the same time as the more common pink ones?
Yes, same time. And I should have showed another picture. There was probably about 12 pink ones and that one white one. So they're right in the same area, same time. So keep your eye out for white at the same time. So yeah.
Okay, and we have another comment from Kitty, says, great enthusiastic presentation and photos. What got you started with your interest in orchids? Was it
it was my dad had a few orchids, some tropical orchids, and he subscribed to the American Orchid Society bulletin. And I just remember as a kid reading these stories of finding these orchids in these really unique habitats, just that kind of orchid hunter, it was just so captivating that these plants would grow in such specialized habitats. So I got interested really into just just reading about orchid explorers, and then just something the flowers just absolute captivate me. So yeah, it's just something about them is just so captivating.
Okay,
Actually,
there's another question that I missed in the chat. Joan Lopez was asking, will orchids grow in clear-cut areas if the stumps have been left so that the soil and the mycorrhiza aren't disturbed, or?
If a big problem with that is what happens is usually the orchids that are growing around those stumps were in a very shaded and moist environment. And then that's what also the fungus in the soil was enjoying. But when the tree gets cut down, all of a sudden it becomes very dry and very hot. So the fungus in the soil doesn't it can die or doesn't thrive in there, and then the orchid is not used to such high levels of light and it will die. So in some of the more subalpine areas like the tway blades and the coral roots, they will not grow when the trees have been cut down. But orchids like calypsos and those rattlesnake plantains, they just hang around if they've just got a little nook there, and they will repopulate second growth area. So some of the more hardier orchids like calypsos and rattlesnake plantains will regrow second growth forests. But a lot of the other plants that we saw today are just too specialized and will not adapt to that change in loss of moisture and shade.
The tiny little subalpine orchid that you showed, the Platanthera coryciana,
Yep,
the plant that it was growing under deer cabbage, or?
that's the one. Yeah, deer cabbage.
And is that kind of a fairly common combination? I mean, is it worth looking when you see deer cabbage? Is it always worth looking to see whether there might be orchids,
Yep.
or how wet? Because it seems to me deer cabbage is sometimes it's growing in kind of almost water. Sometimes it's just kind of more moist areas. Is it more towards the dry end that you find?
Yeah, so I've never found them in standing water. I found them and it's a good time if you usually when the snow melts in those subalpine areas, kind of in June, if you just do some exploring and then move the leaves and look, they've got two very similar to the piperias, those very glossy leaves. And if you find those, then you can come back when in kind of late July, early August when they're blooming. So I've never found them in like standing water, but definitely look for them there. I have also totally a unique environment. It was in another subalpine area, not related to that plant. So the main place they grow is with that deer cabbage, but they can grow without it. But it's I'd say 90% of the ones I found are directly associated with the deer cabbage.
Oh, well, it'll be an interesting one to be looking out for. And now you mentioned that the Platanthera, the tall, white, fragrant Platanthera on Vancouver Island was basically a subalpine plant. Now I've seen lots of them, of tall, white Platanthera growing, say, like ditches beside the Duffy Lake Road and that. Would that be a different species?
No, like you know, for Vancouver Island, the Duffy Lake area is pretty high. So yeah, that's more like the kind of subalpine. Yeah.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be true subalpine, but it's just kind of not at sea level.
Yeah, I'd say kind of 600 meters and up kind of thing. Yeah.
And that was really neat about the mountain lady slipper. We've seen them growing up.
It was
near,
really
Lillooet.
cool. You know, we would yeah, that was really neat to have been refound on Vancouver Island. So yeah.
Well, yeah, we've seen it two places. We've seen it in multiple times up in Botany Valley by the side of the road. But then some years ago, we had stopped our car at a trailhead parking lot along the Squamish Highway and stepped out of the car, and there was one just growing like basically at my feet. I like almost stepped on it. And so I kind of figured it from where it was, like maybe it had come down like with the water and with the water
Who knows?
out from the interior, but it was like what is that doing there? Because we'd only seen them in the one place before, but such a beautiful plant, and what a exciting find to now to kind of know
Yeah.
that, well, there's one more thing to go.
Yeah.
Maybe you can manage it, at least, if not to check out all of those limestoney places. Maybe you can earmark a couple of them for visiting in the next couple of years,
Yeah.
assuming they're not too remote and inaccessible.
All right.
But
Looks like there's a few more questions here.
yes, how many species of orchids do you know of in BC?
I think on eFlora, that's a website, and they've kind of got all the different plants. So if you go into the orchid family there, that's a quick way. I think it's in the 20s. So there's over 20 different species in BC. So eFlora is a great place to just double check the exact number.
Yeah, BC Wildflowers shows 34
Holy, look at that. Yeah, excellent.
for all of BC. Oh yeah, that was another one I was going to ask about, whether it was like on Vancouver as a frog orchid, because I know when we were in Europe, that was one of the few orchids we saw in Europe that it said was also found in BC.
No, I've never found it. I wish I'm hoping to see it on the mainland, but I've never seen it or heard of it on Vancouver Island. But it's a really neat one. Yeah.
And it says, yeah, it has Epipactis gigantea. I'm not sure if that's this another name for a new name for Helleborine or
no, gigantea is a standalone species, and it's actually I'm hoping to do a trip to Washington State. It's found out by Lake Crescent out there. There's a few populations, and it's found a lot more in Washington and Oregon and on the mainland. It's associated. It's also called the stream orchid, and it's totally different than the hellebore. It's a native on the coast. Very beautiful one. Yeah.
Oh yes, well that'll be anyway. So that's 34. That's quite a lot. But how many on Vancouver Island? Because you have how many different ones?
I think we've got about 17.
So that's quite a few for such a restricted
small island. Yeah.
area. If there's only 34 in all of BC, that's pretty great that you've got so many there. So other questions in the chat we have. Are the rare variant colors like the white ones just there for a season and then the plant goes back to making all regular flowers, or will the rare variant come back every year? Is that something you've been able to check for?
Yeah, so this is with all orchids. If the this is determined when it is at the seed, it is genetically without pigment. So right from a little baby seedling, it will always not have pigment. So that plant will always be white forever. Yeah. So
once you earmark that spot on your map, you can go back every year and hope to see the white one.
That's right. Yeah.
And are the white ones, I guess, because that it's like the pigment, so they would still have green, they'd still have chlorophyll in the spring, so they aren't less like necessarily a weaker plant or anything. So
the population that I found, we've had a couple severe droughts on Vancouver Island, and one plant I can't find anymore, and the other one is really struggling. So they are not as vigorous as a regular one with pigment. And I think the pigment helps with sun. They can handle more sun with the pigment. So the albino pigmentless one is not as vigorous as one with pigment.
okay. I think that's all the photos. I had one more question, which Dave was back to one of your the last Pippera that you showed, that ephemerata. Was I correct that it looked like it had kind of more of a one-sided spike, like that the flowers were all kind of facing in one direction, or was that just kind of a fluke of the photo that made it look that?
Which I'm just quickly trying to find it.
Was the last of the Pipperas ephemerata? It's sort of from it looked kind of like maybe the flowers were all facing one
No, that was just those were just leaning towards the light. If it's in a perfect proper lighting situation, it'll be 360 around it, like evenly distributed. Yeah, it's more the photo there. Yeah.
Well, it was a fabulous present. Oh,
I have
another
I
question.
have one question.
Go ahead.
Teresa, you can read it. I sent it to you.
Oh, okay. Another question. Do our orchids grow in the soil? And I have seen tropical orchids grow in the tree trunks and also been told by florists that these imported orchids would die if planted in the soil. So other than that one that you found, are there any others that you know of in North America?
No, so
epiphytic?
all of our native orchids in BC and on Vancouver Island, they all grow in soil. So they're totally different than tropical orchids. Tropical orchids have special kinds of roots that need air and they attach onto trunks. So when you put those into soil, they can't have airflow and then they rot and die. So tropical orchids can't grow in soil. All of our native orchids in BC are soil growing in a lot of humus. Yeah, so they're totally different. Tropical orchids are totally different in the way that their roots work than our native ones.
Thank you.
But it was interesting that you found the rattlesnake plantain growing that's
It's
really
just
unusual.
crazy. You know, there is kind of a topsoil underneath those in the mosses there, but it's like 40 feet up in the tree on these branches. It's just incredible.
Do you know what kind of tree they were? Were they big leaf maples or?
So my initial populations were on Western hemlock, but then I was finding it on red cedar, on Douglas fir, on Sitka spruce. So they are not, it's not looking that it's tree specific. So yeah.
That has to have that really thick layer of moss. And you said you figured would be someplace where there was a lot of fog, so it would really
Yeah, I think the common thing is summer, either clouds come down from the mountains or actual fogs from the ocean that allows that moisture during the summer.
Well, that was super, super interesting to hear about and to get us excited about places that we can go on Vancouver Island. The rare phantom orchid is found in out near Cultus Lake on the Teapot Hill hike. We did one year do a field trip out there to see it. So that is one place where you can, the only place I know around here where you have a chance at the right time of year to see it. But yes, it's always so tricky to know in any given year what's the right time of year. And if you're doing a long drive all the way out to Cultus Lake, plus you can, although I guess nowadays you could probably Google, Teapot Hill orchids or something, or that hike, and you'd see a trip report from somebody who did the hike last week, and you could see whether they'd mentioned it or something. But yeah, there's so many interesting orchids to see, and I know I got hooked on orchids on my first cycling trip in France, because they were growing in the meadows by the side of the road, and I was just so excited by the idea that orchids were just growing by the side of the road. And at that time I really had no idea, other than I guess maybe the fairy slipper, that there were any other orchids in BC. And so then once I kind of got more into the local plants, it was really exciting to discover how many different ones there were in BC. So thank you again, and I'm so glad we were able to get this presentation. Sasha was very, very accommodating, because it's definitely one we've been looking forward to, and given that there's a lot of great information about the kind of habitats and things, I'm certainly know that myself I'm going to be going back to once the recording of the presentation is up, I'm going to be going back to say, where was that one growing and what kind of trees did that particular orchid grow with? Because that was very interesting, and also very interesting that the Cordata tway blade came in different colors. I had no idea. I've only ever seen green, so that's a whole exciting thing for me to be looking for this spring.
Now
So
you're
again, thank you
adventure to,
so much.
yeah, adventure to find the other colors. Yeah.